Nostalgia is a pretty crazy thing. I loved my Game Boy Advance back in the day. I only ever had like a handful of games, but I played that thing so much. Pokemon Sapphire, Legacy of Goku. I really like the Anbernic RG35XX SP because it kind of copies that Game Boy Advance SP form factor, but I never had a Game Boy Advance SP. I only ever had the original purple model. So as much as I like this thing, that little extra hit of nostalgia for people who may have owned an SP back in the day just didn't quite hit for me. So when Anbernic released the RG34XX, which looks like almost an exact copy of the original Game Boy Advance, I knew I had to get my hands on one. And thanks to the folks at 2retro.com, I've got one. You can get it there right now for around $80, but you can use my code PORTLY for 8% off. This video is not sponsored, and I get to say what I want about this thing. They don't make it, they just sell it. I do get a little bit of commission if you use that discount code, but hey, it saves you a little bit of money, and it helps me out a little bit as well, so it's a win-win. They have the RG34XX in a number of colors. I, of course, opted for the purple one here because it is the one that I had back in the day. That $80-ish price tag will get you the 32GB version with no games, with prices increasing by about $10 if you want to go up to 64, 128, and so on, with more and more games the higher you go. You can play NES, SNES, Genesis, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, obviously, PS1, N64, Dreamcast, and even some DS and PSP, just to name a few systems. Anything past N64 is going to be hit and miss as far as performance goes, and obviously this doesn't have a thumbstick, so if you mainly plan to use this for thumbstick-intensive games, maybe don't. It's probably obvious, but I'd say this is the one to get if you're going to be focusing mainly on Game Boy Advance emulation. I am going to focus on what it's like to use this thing out of the box. Custom firmware is great, and everyone will tell you to use that if you can, but a lot of you just want to buy this thing, turn it on, and start playing games, so if that's you, this video is for you. Plus, I think Anbernic's stock firmware is at a point where it's pretty great overall, especially if you're just getting into emulation. Custom firmware is cool, but this will be just fine. So the RG34XX has a 3.4-inch IPS display, hence the 34 in the name. The 720 by 480 pixel resolution is exactly 3 times the size of the original GBA's 240 by 160 screen, which means you're going to get pixel perfect integer scaling for Game Boy Advance games. It's got a 2:3 aspect ratio, which is the same thing the GBA had. The 35XX SP has a slightly larger screen, but it uses a 4:3 aspect ratio, so it's not quite 1-to-1 with the Game Boy Advance games. In fact, by default, RetroArch uses an overlay with a black bar and the Game Boy Advance logo at the bottom of the screen in order to get the correct aspect ratio for the game itself on this 3.5-inch screen. Game Boy Advance games on the 34XX don't do that because the screen is perfect for Game Boy Advance. I've heard Anbernic is planning a 34XX SP, which I'm assuming is going to use the same display here in a clamshell form factor to more closely resemble the original Game Boy Advance SP, and just really make a compelling case for Nintendo someday. If you're looking to play Pokemon games on this thing, which I mean, who could blame you? It's a Game Boy Advance looking device. Pokemon games on Game Boy Advance are among the best. Well, as is the case with all recent Anbernic handhelds, this does not include any Pokemon games out of the box. You're gonna have to source those yourself. I did that, which is why you're seeing it on screen. By the way, every game you're gonna see in this video other than Pokemon came with the 64GB version out of the box. You also aren't gonna find any games with a certain Italian plumber. You know the one. Kinda seems Anbernic doesn't want to draw any legal attention from Nintendo, and I mean, hey, personally, I'm no lawyer, but I think if you don't really want Nintendo to take any legal action against you, it might not be the best idea to release a handheld that looks exactly like one of theirs. I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, this thing is supposedly the same exact measurements as a Game Boy Advance. I don't have one to compare to, but through the magic of opacity, here's an idea of what that looks like. The 2 extra face buttons on the right bring the B and A buttons down just a bit from the original, and the larger screen brings the start and select a little over to the left directly under the D-pad. This makes it a little awkward to pause games, but it's not bad. It's just something I was able to notice when playing. There are also 2 extra shoulder buttons that make sure you have all the buttons you need for something like PS1. Nothing for C buttons for N64 really, so you'll have to configure that yourself somehow. Again, I really don't recommend this thing for N64 emulation. The D-pad is configured to work as a thumbstick for N64 out of the box, so for the handful of N64 games on the 64GB version, you should at least be able to play those for the most part. The D-pad itself is fine. It's small, but so was the D-pad on the original GBA. It functions well, and if you're just going to throw some Pokemon games on here, you'll feel right at home. It works well enough for fighting games, and it passes the Contra test, meaning no accidental diagonals when holding down and wiggling the D-pad. The face buttons are also good. B and A are a little bit larger than X and Y, which also aren't labeled, by the way. They really wanted this thing to look like a Game Boy Advance as much as possible. The extra shoulder buttons take quite a bit of force to press compared to the main shoulder buttons. Personally, I don't see myself playing a lot of games on this thing that would use these a lot, so it's not so bad. If anything, I can just assign these to hotkeys. In between those, you've got the two micro SD card slots, one for the OS and one for your games. I thought that this blue one with the OS was a Kioxia SD card, which is a pretty reliable card. I've had a couple Anbernic devices come with them. Kioxia is apparently part of Toshiba, and these are pretty decent cards from what I hear. But it's not one of those. It's colored to look like one, but it's a generic no-brand card, and that kind of sucks. And then the other one is also colored to look like a brand name card. It looks like a SanDisk, but it's not, so this whole thing is just full of lies. I would definitely try to replace both of these with something from Samsung or SanDisk. You'll just need a means to copy your files over, or you can start fresh with whatever firmware on one card and your ROMs on the other. You got a reset button and menu button at the top here, as well as a USB-C charging port and a mini HDMI port in case you want to play this thing on a TV or monitor. The bottom has a power button, a headphone jack, and this volume wheel, which is not a continuous wheel like on the original GBA. It kind of rocks back and forth and recenters when you let go, and you have to rock it in whichever direction you want multiple times just to adjust the volume. It's a little cumbersome compared to, like, volume buttons, and you can't just hold it. You have to rock it each time. Battery life has been pretty good, especially when putting this thing to sleep, as silly as that might sound. I mean, the Miu Mini Plus was one of my first handheld emulation systems, and out of the box, it would just drain as fast in sleep mode as it would while it was awake. I'm talking, you put that thing in sleep mode overnight, by morning it's dead. But more and more recently, a lot of these don't do that anymore. We've come a long way, and it's nice to know that this will hold a charge for at least several days in case I forget to turn it off, which I have done. When you're actively playing, battery life is generally around 7 hours according to Anbernic. I don't play these things for long enough at a time to tell you if that's true, but it generally does seem about right. And as always, that will decrease if you're playing more intensive systems like PS1, N64, or anything beyond that. One downside that I hesitate to even really call a downside is it's not the most comfortable handheld. The slopes on the back along the sides here where you put your hands just make this not the most ergonomic handheld. I almost want to say it's slightly slippery compared to other handhelds, but again, I hesitate to even call that a downside of the RG34XX itself, because that's just what the GBA was like. This is copying that design, and that's what it was like. The only reason I even really notice it so much is because I already have some pre-existing pain issues where I can't even really play with more comfortable handhelds or controllers for that long. So if ergonomics are a must, this might be one to skip unless you mainly plan to play for shorter sessions, which is exactly how I use these things anyway, so I'm happy to say that I plan to use this thing probably exclusively as my go-to for GBA emulation. It's a great little handheld, and the nostalgia is taking me back to the old days of actually sitting and playing Game Boy Advance, and it just makes it a really big draw for me. And that screen making this ideal for GBA is a huge win too. Side note, I just reviewed the RG34XX, which is a great handheld for Game Boy and Game Boy Color because of the big 4-inch 1:1 aspect ratio screen. I decided to compare it to the 34XX, and it looks like Game Boy Advance games are pretty much the same size on both devices, so if you really want to play a blend of Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, you might want to check that one out. You could probably find this for around a similar prices to the 34XX, but as you could probably see here, it is much less portable, much less pocketable in size. But altogether, yeah, this thing is great. It's not the most comfortable device, but if you're in it purely for the nostalgia like I am, I think you're gonna enjoy this one. And hey, you know what? That's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you watch another one. I've got them here on screen. Make sure you like this one as well before you leave. Leave a comment, subscribe if you're new, tell your friends about this video, tell your friends about the channel. And thank you guys so much for watching. I've got a couple more handheld reviews coming up very soon, hopefully. So stick around, and yeah, thank you guys for watching. I'm out of here.